Hello and welcome back to the channel, welcome to my home. And today I'm going to do a video about one particular topic, one story that has been in and out of the media for what seems like an absolute age. And it's starting to annoy me. I've already made a video or two about this topic before, and I think it's finally time to put together what we do know, what we don't know, and all of the facts regarding Prince Andrew and his lease of Royal Lodge in Windsor. Now, for those of you who didn't know, Royal Lodge is a rather large building on the Windsor estate. I will pop various pictures up throughout this video to illustrate what I'm talking about. It was previously the home of the late Queen's mother, the Queen Mother, and then when she passed away, it was decided that Prince Andrew would take on the lease, pay for the lease, do the renovations, and then live there potentially for the next 75 years, where that lease could then be passed down either to a spouse or his daughters. I'll read some factual information about all of that in a moment, but I want to address the headline that's been out and about from our good old friends at the Daily Mail. And they say Prince Andrew has no long-term future at his Royal Lodge home. Right, so what I think we need to look at here is, first of all, is this the work of kind of royal moles or sort of royal leakages to the press? We have seen in previous years, especially with regards to Harry and Meghan, that this does exist, it does go on. My opinions have definitely changed when it comes to royal sources from the times before Harry and Meghan left. You know, Harry and Meghan themselves have basically confirmed that a lot of these stories that reach the press have at least some basis in truth. They might not be the whole truth, but they have at least some basis in truth. Harry basically said most of the things that was leaked to the media or indeed hacked were true from Spare. Anyway, if it is to be believed that King Charles privately believes that he has no long-term future at Royal Lodge, then that could possibly explain why, partly Andrew's funds were cut by His Majesty. Of course, the annual allowance given by Her late Majesty was reduced, basically because Andrew is no longer a working royal. He doesn't have to carry out any functions with that regard. So technically, did he need that much money to come from the crown? Probably not. Now, we don't know this is something we don't know. We don't know the state of Andrew's finances. The late Queen's will is not disclosed, unlike you would find with an everyday person's will. An Act of Parliament prevents that from happening. So, the will may be revealed in over 100 years, but we are not going to know the contents of it in our lifetime. So we don't know what provisions Her late Majesty left for certain members of her family, including her children and grandchildren. We do know from what people have said that the late Queen Mother did leave certain amounts of money in trust for her grandchildren. The bulk of Her Majesty's money would have gone to Charles, which would have been exempt from inheritance tax from sovereign to sovereign transfer. Also, that would have had benefits in terms of keeping everything together. So we don't know what was left to Andrew. Also, we don't know whether or not Andrew sort of forfeited potentially part of his inheritance for potentially some money that was given to help him out in earlier times. Of course, I'm talking the payment that he made to Virginia Giuffre. So we don't know the state of Andrew's finances. We don't actually know how much money he's got. He sold his Swiss ski chalet, jointly owned with ex-wife Sarah Ferguson, or Sarah, Duchess of York. So we don't even know how things work when it's kind of jointly owned. Could any money have been taken from something that's jointly owned? Did they have to pay back a large amount of mortgage, so there probably wouldn't have been much left from that payment. So, like I say, we don't know how much money he has. Therefore, we don't know how much he has to spend on Royal Lodge. Now, Royal Lodge, like I say, was renovated by him. I think he paid £7.5 million just on the renovations back in the early 2000s, or sort of mid 2000s. And he did an extensive renovation works. It's said that the roof needs attention now, and also there is possibly a whole house damp issue that needs sorting. So this bill could run into the estimated millions. And I think it's been rumoured that £200,000 was spent during the summer as an interim payment. Again, we don't know whether this is true or not. So some work is being done by Andrew. I think this whole issue of does he have any long-term future all depends, like I just said, on the money. Does Prince Andrew and of course Sarah have the long-term capacity to fund living at such a big property? The staff, the maintenance, which is always going to be ongoing. I mean, anyone who's a homeowner will know that maintenance just carries on. It's almost like, you start doing something one end, and then by the time you finish the whole house, something needs doing it again. And in a large property like Royal Lodge, that's always the case. So I think it just depends on money. Legally, King Charles or the Crown Estates cannot force Andrew out of Royal Lodge. He has legally the lease. So they can't budge him. Andrew himself could choose to leave. Now, if he leaves before the lease is up, which of course is longer than his lifespan anyway, then the Crown Estates would likely have to pay Andrew money back because he's ended that lease early. And then potentially Andrew could go to a smaller property. It doesn't even necessarily have to be in Windsor. It could be anywhere on any kind of royal estates. I mean, he potentially could go to Sandringham or anywhere that's got a royal property. I don't think he wants Frogmore Cottage. It kind of makes sense because, Sarah and Andrew rattling around in a big, massive mansion, basically, it's not necessary. It doesn't mean that, a couple can't enjoy a big house. There's nothing in writing that once your family sort of grows up and moves on that you have to downsize. That's not a requirement, and I don't think it should necessarily be an expectation. However, we do have a family living at Windsor, the Waleses, which would actually benefit from a larger property. And I think, if anything, that's what King Charles was potentially thinking, was that, okay, William and Catherine have moved to Windsor, they're in the much smaller Adelaide cottage. Royal Lodge would be a more appropriate sized property for them and their 3 children now and into the future. Frogmore Cottage would have been a much more appropriate size for Andrew and Sarah and any visiting guests. So I can see the logic, but like I say, I don't think there necessarily should be the expectation of downsizing. And the fact that Andrew hasn't moved out of Royal Lodge to go to Frogmore Cottage, I think we can safely say that he doesn't want to do that. So we're left with, if he can afford to stay and run and maintain Royal Lodge, then he cannot be forced out. Potentially the king, by cutting his annual payment, may have been trying to force his hand. Who knows? Or it could have just been simply, well, you're not doing the royal duties anymore, therefore we can't justify that payment. It could be something as simple as that. So now I'm going to read a little bit of information just so we can be 100% clear over what Prince Andrew's lease actually means, because there's been lots of stories in the press, not only from journalists, but lots of people now, on Twitter, other YouTube channels, people that really you could check this kind of information out. I got it in front of me now. And they're just basically putting out a complete load of nonsense. And it kind of gets my goat a little bit. So I'm going to read little bits of recap of what I've just said, but also, so these are the facts, okay? In August 2003, Andrew was granted a lease agreement by the Crown Estates for 75 years. This is indisputable. The property leased included Royal Lodge, a gardener's cottage, the Chapel Lodge, 6 lodge cottages, and police security accommodation, in addition to 80 hectares of land. So it's not just the building, it really is kind of its own estate within Windsor Great Park. The lease agreement required Andrew to carry out, at his own expense, refurbishments estimated at £7.5 million, excluding VAT, and that's what it would be worth in today's money. It also provided a premium payment of £1 million. So when people talk about Andrew not paying rent, he doesn't need to pay rent because he's already paid £1 million for the initial lease for 75 years, plus £7.5 million in today's money for the refurbishments and ongoing repairs, which is what we're seeing now. So the National Audit Office report into the lease agreement, which is recent, stated that the Crown Estate's independent advisors had advised that the refurbishment work would cost at least £5 million, and that the Prince should be given the option to buy out the national annual rental payment set at £260,000 for £2.5 million in today's money. So once the Prince committed to spending that £7.5 million, it was decided that no rental would be required, as he would be treated as having effectively bought out the notional annual rental payment because he exceeded the £5 million required refurbishment. As a result, only the £1 million premium was paid to the Crown Estate. So it's all viable and accounted for. There is no provision for any further rent review over the life of the 75-year lease, unlike the rent reviews provided for Prince Edward for Bagshot Park. The lease agreement provides that the Prince may not benefit financially from any increase in the value of the property, as the freehold still belongs to the Crown Estate. The leasehold may be assigned only, so he can't sell it on, may be assigned only to his widow, which is not Sarah Ferguson because they're not married, they're divorced, or his 2 daughters, Princess Beatrice of York and Princess Eugenie of York. Of course, they are still very much alive, so potentially that lease could be taken on by Beatrice and Eugenie, who in turn could decide, well, we don't want to use it as a family home, therefore we're going to terminate that lease, and then the Crown Estates would have to pay Beatrice and Eugenie back some money. Or it could be put in a trust established solely for their benefit. If the Prince terminates the lease, the property reverts to the Crown Estates. He would be entitled to compensation for the refurbishment costs incurred, up to a maximum of just under £7 million, which is reduced annually over the first 25 years, after which no compensation is payable. So he's kind of getting close to the point where no compensation would be payable. So if he was to make a move, then now would be a good time to do it. The fact that he hasn't kind of proves to me, maybe for starters, he's actually got more money than what we think. Because if he was so desperate for money, he'd want to hand it over, get some money back, move to a smaller property, downsize, pay less maintenance costs. So Frogmore Cottage would have been a good option. The fact that he's kind of dragging his feet, it's either an issue of pride. He doesn't want to be seen to be moving to a much smaller property. Not only has he been reduced in his kind of in his work within the royal family, but also reduced in status in where he lives. So is he just fronting it out? That's something to think about. The report also states that having already taken advice from one independent advisor, the Crown Estates appointed a second firm of independent advisors to assess the details of the lease, given its importance. The second independent advisor concluded that the deal was appropriate, having regard to for the need to maintain management control over Royal Lodge and because of the security implications, particularly concerning the royal family's access to the Chapel Royal, or the Royal Chapel. In the circumstances, the Crown Estates considered that the requirement to obtain value for money was satisfied, taking into account the non-financial considerations relating to the lease of the property. The alternative use, to lease it on the commercial market, which has been spoken about in the press, should Andrew move out because the Crown Estate can get better value for money by leasing it out, was not possible. So the audit report said that it cannot be leased out because of the security concerns and access to the Royal Chapel. If you're wondering what chapel, it's the chapel that's, if you look at Google Maps, it's right next door to Royal Lodge, not very far away at all. And it's the one where Princess Beatrice got married. And we saw those wonderful photographs of her in her grandmother's gown with the tiara, the fringe tiara. And of course, the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen were in attendance. So, obviously they moved in 2004 as a family. Well, not as a family. Sarah didn't move in at the time. Sarah moved in later in 2008. The value of the property on the open market today, if it could be sold, is valued at £30 million. So there we go. That's the factual information that we do know. I've spoken about all the different things kind of that we don't know about Andrew's financial situation. But the one thing that is clear is that if Andrew cannot afford to stay at Royal Lodge, and by the way, he hasn't made, as far as we're aware, any, public, he hasn't tried publicly to sort of make money. He hasn't written a book. He hasn't gone on anything or said anything or done any further interviews. So Andrew has not been sort of outwardly making money. It all hinges on whether he can afford to run and maintain Royal Lodge. That is what we're going to have to wait and see. Often as royal watchers, we have to wait and see what happens. Okay, it's all as clear as mud, isn't it, my loves? But anyway, the upshot is King Charles can't kick Andrew out. But potentially, if he can't afford the upkeep, that could be a reason to perhaps instigate looking at that lease. Okay, thank you. There also could be a clause as well. If you can't maintain, then it could be retracted, but money could be paid back if owed. Right, I'm going now. That's a lot of information to digest. Thank you for watching this video. If you have enjoyed it, please give it a big old thumbs up. Don't forget to share on social media, and of course hit the bell so that you know whenever I upload a new video. From me, to you all, and goodbye.